In the last 24 hours, something happened that almost nobody in mainstream media is talking about. An institution that has stood for 85 years, a body created in the darkest days of World War II, specifically to keep North America safe, was suspended by the Trump administration without a replacement, without a plan, and without a public explanation that makes any strategic sense. The board that kept the United States and Canada coordinated through the Cold War, through 9/11, through every Russian provocation in the Arctic for 8 decades, is now effectively dead. And what terrifies defense analysts right now is not just what was lost. It is what that loss reveals about where we are heading. This is Strategic Frontline, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell, because what we are about to walk through changes everything you thought you knew about North American security. Let us start with what actually happened, because the official language around this is deliberately vague, and that vagueness is itself a red flag. The Trump administration formally suspended United States participation in the Permanent Joint Board on Defense. Most people reading that sentence have no idea what that means. And that is exactly the problem, because the people who do know what it means, former generals, intelligence officials, Arctic strategy experts, are not sleeping well tonight. The Permanent Joint Board on Defense, known as the PJBD, was created in August of 1940. Let that date sink in for a moment. August 1940. Adolf Hitler's forces had already overrun France. Britain was being bombed nightly. The Atlantic was a killing ground for German submarines. And two nations, the United States and Canada, looked at what was happening to the world and made a decision. Whatever happens, North America will not fall, because we failed to talk to each other. President Franklin Roosevelt and Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King met at Ogdensburg, New York, and signed an agreement that created the PJBD on the spot. It was not a treaty that took years to ratify. It was a handshake backed by strategic necessity, and it became one of the most durable defense arrangements in the history of modern warfare. For 85 years, through every shift in American and Canadian politics, through conservative governments and liberal governments, through trade disputes and diplomatic tensions, the PJBD survived. It survived because every administration on both sides of the border understood something fundamental. North America is one defense ecosystem. You cannot protect the United States without protecting Canada. You cannot secure the Arctic approaches without both nations working in lockstep. The board met regularly. It shared intelligence. It coordinated radar networks. It planned responses to threats that the public never even heard about. It was quiet, professional, and absolutely essential. And now it is suspended. But that is not the real problem. The real problem is the timing. And this is where things get worse. We are living through the most significant period of Arctic militarization since the Cold War. Russia has been systematically rebuilding its northern military infrastructure for over a decade. New bases, upgraded submarine fleets, hypersonic missile systems positioned along the Arctic coast. China, which has declared itself a near-Arctic nation, despite having no Arctic territory, has been pouring investment into northern shipping routes and polar research stations that defense analysts understand serve a dual military purpose. The Arctic is no longer a frozen buffer zone. It is rapidly becoming the most contested strategic space on the planet. And at this precise moment, at the exact moment when North American defense cooperation should be at its most intensive, the United States has suspended the primary institutional mechanism through which that cooperation has functioned for 85 years. Military analysts are already warning that the consequences will not be felt immediately. They will be felt gradually, invisibly, and then all at once. Think about how a bridge deteriorates. You do not see the structural damage happening day by day. The cables fray slowly. The supports weaken quietly. And then one day, without warning, the load becomes too much and the whole thing comes down. That is exactly how institutional defense breakdowns work. You remove the coordination layer, and for a while, the existing systems continue operating on momentum. But the gaps begin to open. The misunderstandings multiply. The response timelines lengthen. And eventually, something critical falls through. Intelligence reports suggest the PJBD was doing more than people realize. It was not just a talking shop. It was the connective tissue between two defense bureaucracies that speak slightly different institutional languages. The Americans and Canadians both have massive, complex defense establishments. They use different procurement systems, different command structures, different threat assessment frameworks. The PJBD was the translator. It was the room where American generals and Canadian commanders sat across a table and made sure that when a Russian bomber approached the Arctic identification zone, both nations knew exactly what the other was doing and why. Take that room away, and you do not just lose a meeting. You lose the shared understanding that makes joint operations possible. Now let us talk about NORAD, because this is where things become genuinely alarming. The North American Aerospace Defense Command is the joint U.S Canada operation responsible for monitoring and defending North American airspace. It has been operational since 1958. It watches for incoming missiles, hostile aircraft, and aerospace threats from its headquarters deep inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. And right now, NORAD is in the middle of the most significant modernization effort in its history. The systems that currently guard North America were built for a different era. The radar networks, the communication systems, the sensor infrastructure, much of it dates back to Cold War era technology that was never designed to detect the kind of threats that Russia and China are now deploying. The modernization program is called NORAD Modernization, and it is a multi-billion-dollar initiative designed to replace aging infrastructure with systems that can detect hypersonic glide vehicles, advanced cruise missiles flying at low altitudes, and threats approaching from unexpected vectors, including over the North Pole. Defense experts understand that this modernization is not optional. It is existential. The window of vulnerability, the gap between old systems going offline and new systems coming online, is already a matter of serious concern in classified defense planning circles. And the PJBD was one of the primary mechanisms for coordinating the Canadian contribution to that modernization. Canada hosts critical radar installations. Canada provides airspace access. Canada contributes funding and personnel. Without the PJBD, the institutional framework for coordinating all of that with the United States has just been severed. And this is where everything breaks down. Because the reality is that NORAD modernization was already behind schedule, not catastrophically behind, not publicly behind, but behind in the quiet ways that defense insiders track with growing anxiety, supply chain issues, budget disputes, the technical complexity of integrating legacy systems with new sensor arrays. These were manageable problems with active bilateral coordination. They become potentially unmanageable without it. Military analysts are already warning that the suspension of the PJBD creates a coordination vacuum that the existing NORAD command structure was never designed to fill on its own. NORAD is an operational command. It executes plans. The PJBD was where those plans were developed, debated, and refined at the policy level. You cannot ask an operational military command to do both jobs simultaneously without something breaking. But that is not the real problem either. The real problem runs even deeper than NORAD. Consider what intelligence reports suggest about Russian submarine activity in the Arctic over the past 18 months. Russian ballistic missile submarines, the ones carrying the warheads that define the nuclear balance of power, have been increasing their operational tempo in Arctic waters. They are testing new routes. They are probing for gaps in the detection network. They are doing exactly what you would expect a sophisticated adversary to do when it senses that the other side's attention is divided. And right now, the other side's attention is very divided. The trade war with Canada, the suspension of the PJBD, the ongoing political turbulence in Washington, all of it sends a signal to Moscow that the North American Defense Alliance is experiencing internal stress. And adversaries do not ignore stress signals. They exploit them. China is watching this with equal intensity. The People's Liberation Army has been developing what analysts call anti-access and area denial capabilities, specifically designed to complicate American military responses in the Pacific. But China's strategic planners are not just focused on the Pacific. They have been investing heavily in understanding Arctic approaches, polar navigation, and the vulnerabilities of North American early warning systems. A weakened U.S. Canada defense relationship is not an abstraction in Beijing. It is a data point in a complex strategic calculation about where and when American power can be effectively challenged. Let us now talk about the options, because when you present this situation to serious defense analysts, not the television commentators, the actual people who spent careers thinking about this, they will walk you through several possible responses. And this is the part that should make you uncomfortable, because none of the options are good. Option one is that the suspension is temporary and political. The argument goes like this. The Trump administration is in a trade dispute with Canada. The PJBD suspension is a pressure tactic, and once the trade issues are resolved, everything goes back to normal. This sounds reassuring. It is not. Even if the suspension is reversed in 6 months, the institutional damage does not simply reset. The planning cycles that were interrupted do not automatically resume. The NORAD modernization timelines that slipped do not catch up on their own. And perhaps most critically, the signal that has been sent to Moscow and Beijing that the U.S. Canada relationship is instrumentalizable as a political weapon does not unsend. Adversaries have long memories. They will file this moment away. Option two is that Canada compensates by deepening defense ties with other allies, the United Kingdom, Australia, European partners. Canada is a member of NATO. Canada is a Five Eyes intelligence partner. The argument is that Canada can route its security cooperation through other channels and maintain effective defense integration without the PJBD. Defense experts understand why this argument fails immediately. The PJBD was specifically designed for the unique geographic and strategic reality of North America. The Arctic approaches to the United States run through Canadian territory. There is no NATO partner, no Five Eyes alternative that can replicate what Canada provides in that specific context. Britain cannot put radar systems on Baffin Island. Australia cannot monitor the Beaufort Sea. The geography is irreplaceable, and the coordination mechanism for that geography has just been suspended. Option 3 is that the U.S military simply absorbs the coordination function internally. American generals talk directly to Canadian counterparts through existing NORAD channels, bypassing the political level PJBD entirely. This sounds operationally elegant. It has a fatal flaw. The PJBD operated at the policy level, not just the operational level. It was where decisions about funding, basing rights, airspace agreements, and long-term strategic planning were made. Military commanders cannot make those decisions. Only governments can make those decisions. And without the PJBD, there is no standing forum where the two governments systematically make them. You end up with ad hoc conversations replacing a structured institutional process. And ad hoc is always slower, always less reliable, and always more vulnerable to political disruption. Option 4 is the most dangerous possibility. What if the suspension is not a tactic, but a symptom? What if it reflects a genuine shift in American strategic thinking about the value of the Canada relationship, not as a lever in a trade dispute, but as a fundamental reassessment of how the United States wants to organize its defense architecture? There have been public statements from figures close to the current administration suggesting that Canada should simply become the 51st state, that the border is an artificial construct, that Canadian sovereignty over Arctic waters is contestable. Most analysts dismiss these as rhetorical provocations, but the suspension of the PJBD is not rhetoric. It is an institutional action with real consequences. And if it reflects a genuine belief that Canada should be absorbed rather than allied with, then we are not looking at a temporary disruption. We are looking at a fundamental restructuring of North American security that no existing framework was designed to manage. Option 5 is that Canada and the United States find some new bilateral mechanism to replace the PJBD, a modern, updated institution that performs the same coordinating function without the baggage of an 85-year-old framework. In theory, this could work. In practice, building institutional trust takes decades. The PJBD worked because generations of military and civilian officials had built relationships inside it, had developed shared procedures, had created a common institutional culture. You cannot replace that with a new agency in months or even years. The gap between suspension and effective replacement, if replacement even happens, is a period of genuine strategic vulnerability. And that gap is happening right now. Defense experts understand that the most dangerous moments in strategic history are not the dramatic confrontations that everyone sees coming. They are the quiet institutional collapses, the moments when a load-bearing wall is removed from a structure and nobody notices until the weight becomes too much. The suspension of the PJBD is the removal of a load-bearing wall. The building is still standing. The structure looks intact from the outside, but the engineering has changed in ways that are not visible until the load increases and the support is no longer there. We are entering a period, call it the next 18 to 36 months, that strategic analysts have been quietly flagging as a window of elevated risk. Russia completing its Arctic military buildup, China moving through a critical phase of military modernization, the nuclear balance of power shifting in ways that have not been publicly acknowledged, and North America arriving at this window with a degraded institutional framework for its own internal defense coordination. The people who track these things professionally are not given to panic. They are trained to be cold-eyed and analytical. And the cold-eyed analytical assessment right now is that this is a serious problem. Let us be precise about what we do not know. We do not know the full internal reasoning behind the suspension. We do not know whether there are parallel diplomatic conversations happening that provide some alternative coordination channel. We do not know exactly how long the suspension will last or what conditions might prompt reversal. Intelligence reports suggest that some informal military-to-military communication channels remain open at the NORAD operational level. That is not nothing, but it is also not sufficient. Informal channels cannot replace formal institutional architecture. Workarounds cannot substitute for systems, and good intentions cannot compensate for the absence of structured coordination at the policy level. What we do know is this: the decision was made. The institution is suspended. The gap is real. And every day that gap exists, the cost accumulates in degraded coordination, in lost planning time, in signals sent to adversaries, in confidence eroded among allies. Time is not neutral in strategic affairs. Time is always working for someone. Right now, it is not working for North America. So where does this leave us? The honest answer is somewhere deeply uncomfortable. We are in uncharted territory. In 85 years, there has never been a moment when the Permanent Joint Board on Defense was suspended. Not during the Korean War, not during the Cuban Missile Crisis, not during the deepest Cold War tensions, not during any trade dispute, any political confrontation, any bilateral friction of any kind. This moment is genuinely unprecedented. And unprecedented moments carry unprecedented risks because there is no playbook, no institutional memory, no tested response protocol for what comes next. The questions that serious defense analysts are asking right now and not getting answers to are the ones that should be keeping policymakers awake. If the PJBD is suspended, what is the crisis communication channel if a genuine North American security emergency develops? If NORAD modernization coordination degrades, what is the revised timeline for Arctic sensor coverage? And what are the detection gaps that exist in the interim? If Russia or China interprets the suspension as evidence of a fracturing alliance, what deterrent signals replace the ones that have just been degraded? And perhaps most fundamentally, who made this decision? Who was consulted? And what was the strategic logic that concluded that the benefits outweighed these costs? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the specific operational, strategic questions that the people responsible for North American security need to be answering right now. Whether they are being answered and whether those answers are adequate, that is something we do not yet know. And that uncertainty in a situation this consequential is itself the most dangerous thing of all. The truth is that great powers are not defeated only on battlefields. They are sometimes defeated first in the quiet institutional spaces where coordination happens or fails to happen, where allies either build the mechanisms of shared defense or allow them to atrophy, where the small decisions about which meetings to attend, which boards to sustain, which relationships to preserve become, over time, the decisions that determine whether a security architecture holds or collapses under pressure. The Permanent Joint Board on Defense was one of those quiet institutional spaces. For 85 years, it held. Now it has been suspended. The Arctic is not guarded differently than it was yesterday in a kinetic sense. The radar installations are still running. The aircraft are still on alert. The missiles are still in their silos, but the coordination layer that ensures all of those systems work together coherently and that the two nations operating them are genuinely aligned. That layer has just been removed, And in a complex system, removing a coordination layer does not leave the system unchanged. It changes the system in ways that compound over time, that accelerate under pressure, and that reveal themselves most completely at the exact moment you can least afford them to. Stay alert, stay informed, because what happens in the next weeks and months in this space will tell us whether this was a calculated political maneuver with a planned exit, or whether we have just watched one of the most consequential, quiet, strategic errors of the decade unfold in real time. The board that kept North America safe since 1940 has been suspended. Nobody has announced what replaces it, and the clock is running.